Hey there, crime fans. Most detectives look for fingerprints, some hunt for DNA. Me? I play detective with blood drops. And yes, that coffee stain on my shirt is not evidence. That's from this morning's caffeine emergency. Welcome to the Scribbled Detective, where I, ForenStick, your favourite stick figure forensic scientist, break down the messy science that supposedly catches killers. Today's case: how a flashlight with tiny blood spots sent an innocent high school principal to prison for over 3 decades, and why blood spatter analysis might be less science and more expensive guessing. So grab your beverage of choice, preferably not red, and let's splash into this disaster. Bloodstain pattern analysis, or BPA if you're too lazy to say the whole thing. It's the study of blood drops, spatters, and smears at crime scenes to figure out what happened. When blood leaves the body, physics takes over. Gravity pulls it down. Velocity determines distance. Surface tension keeps drops together. So theoretically, by studying bloodstain size, shape, and location, experts can work backward to figure out where victims stood, what weapons were used, how many times someone got hit, and whether someone's story is complete nonsense. Different actions create different patterns. Passive drops fall straight down from gravity. Boring. Transfer stains happen when something bloody touches something clean, like a handprint or shoe print. Impact spatter is blood flying through the air from violence, beatings, stabbings, gunshots. The faster the force, the smaller the droplets. Cast-off patterns come from blood flinging off a weapon mid-swing. Each swing creates its own arc, so analysts can literally count how many times someone got whacked. Sounds pretty scientific, right? Here's the problem. Crime scenes are messy. Blood lands on fabric, furniture, textured walls. It pools, smears, gets disturbed. Two experts can look at the same blood stain and reach completely opposite conclusions. One sees murder, another sees suicide, both pointing at the exact same evidence. Which brings us to Texas, 1985, and a case that shows everything wrong with blood spatter testimony. Clifton, Texas, October 15th, 1985, a small town where everyone knows everyone. Mickey Bryan, a beloved 4th grade teacher, is found shot to death in her home. Her husband, Joe Bryan, was a respected high school principal attending an education conference in Austin, 120 miles away. Joe said he was asleep in his hotel room when the murder happened. Multiple witnesses placed him at the conference. But investigators focused on one piece of evidence: a flashlight found in the trunk of Joe's car 4 days after the murder by Mickey's brother. The flashlight had tiny blood spots on it. Here's where things get sketchy. In 1985, before DNA testing, a crime lab technician determined the blood was type O, which matched Mickey, but also matched nearly half the population, so prosecutors needed to connect that flashlight to the crime scene. Enter Robert Thorman, a police detective with exactly 40 hours of training in bloodstain pattern analysis. 40 hours. That's like 1 work week. You get more training to become a barista. Thorman testified that the tiny blood specks on the flashlight were back spatter, a pattern indicating close-range shooting. His conclusion: the killer held this flashlight while shooting Mickey at close range. Therefore, Joe Bryan must be the killer. The jury believed him. Joe Bryan was convicted of murder and sentenced to 99 years in prison. He maintained his innocence. For over 30 years, he sat in prison, insisting he didn't kill his wife. Fast forward to 2018. Joe Bryan's case gets a second look. The Texas Forensic Science Commission, a national leader in forensic reform, asks bloodstain expert Celestina Rossi to review Thorman's testimony. Her assessment: egregiously wrong. She said Bryan deserved a new trial if any juror relied on that testimony to convict him. Then came the bombshell. In September 2018, at an evidentiary hearing, Thorman himself submitted a sworn affidavit that said, quote, "My conclusions were wrong. Some of the techniques and methodology were incorrect. Therefore, some of my testimony was not correct." End quote. Let me repeat that. The expert whose testimony sent Joe Bryan to prison for 3 decades admitted he was wrong. the Texas Forensic Science Commission officially declared the blood spatter analysis used to convict Bryan was, quote, not accurate or scientifically supported, end quote. But here's the truly infuriating part. Despite all this, the judge still recommended that Bryan's conviction stand and denied him a new trial. Joe Bryan remained in prison. It wasn't until 2020, after spending 33 years behind bars, that Joe Bryan was finally released on parole. Not exonerated, not declared innocent, just paroled. He was 77 years old, suffering from congestive heart failure, and the world he returned to had completely changed. He went to prison before cell phones and the internet existed. The Joe Bryan case isn't unique. It's part of a much bigger pattern of wrongful convictions based on questionable blood spatter testimony. David Cam, an Indiana state trooper who found his wife and 2 children shot to death in 2000. He was immediately charged with their murders. Over 3 trials, prosecutors presented bloodstain experts who testified that 8 tiny specks of blood on his shirt were high-velocity impact spatter from the shooting. The defense brought their own experts who said those were transfer stains from when Cam tried to help. Same blood, opposite conclusions. One witness noted this amounted to a 50% error rate. Cam spent 13 years in prison before being acquitted in 2013. DNA later led to the real killer, or Julie Rhea, convicted in 2002 of murdering her 10-year-old son, based largely on bloodstain testimony. Years later, a serial killer confessed to the crime. She was exonerated. In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences released a devastating report calling bloodstain pattern analysis, quote, more subjective than scientific, end quote, with, quote, enormous uncertainties, end quote. The report found that experts often, quote, extrapolate far beyond what can be supported, end quote, by the evidence. A study gave 75 practicing bloodstain analysts the same 150 patterns to examine. They frequently disagreed on what they were looking at. Many conclusions were flat out wrong. Robert Shaler, a forensic scientist, called it, quote, essentially guesswork, end quote. A defense attorney was even more blunt, saying it's, quote, as accurate as a Ouija board, end quote. Ouch. Not exactly. Blood does obey physics. The problem is human interpretation and lack of standards. Some analysts have PhDs and decades of experience. Others, like Thorman, take a 40-hour course, and suddenly they're expert witnesses in murder trials. The good news? The Joe Bryan case sparked real reform. In 2019, the Texas Forensic Science Commission moved to end the practice of allowing law enforcement officers with minimal training to testify about bloodstain analysis in Texas. Now, such analysis must be performed by an accredited organization to be admissible in court. Other states are expected to follow. Modern researchers are using fluid dynamics and physics to create accurate models of blood behavior. They're building databases of controlled experiments. Courts are getting stricter about who qualifies as an expert, but the damage has been done to thousands of lives. Here's what we learned today. Blood doesn't lie, but humans reading that blood absolutely can get it wrong. Joe Bryan lost 33 years of his life based on testimony from a detective with 40 hours of training who later admitted he was wrong. Even after that admission, the system still fought to keep him in prison. Bloodstain pattern analysis can provide valuable insights when done carefully by qualified experts who acknowledge uncertainty. But when done poorly by overconfident analysts, it destroys lives. The real lesson? Forensic science isn't always as definitive as crime shows make it seem. Sometimes expert testimony is just one person's opinion dressed up in scientific language. The good news is the system is slowly improving. Standards are getting stricter. Training is getting better, courts are more skeptical, but for Joe Bryan and countless others, those reforms came too late. This has been the Scribbled Detective. I'm ForenStick, reminding you that science is only as good as the scientists behind it, and sometimes experts are just people who took a short course and got overconfident. If you learned something today, hit that like button. And remember, always question the evidence, even when someone calls it science. See you next time, crime fans. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never trust testimony from someone with only 40 hours of training. Peace out.